Welcome back to the Art Elevator podcast. Today, we are honored to have our guest Aubrey Catrone returning for another episode to share her expertise. Aubrey is an international art historian, appraiser, and provenance researcher. Aubrey earned an MA in the history of art from University College London, specializing in the documented histories of art objects. With an art gallery and academic research background, Aubrey founded Proper Provenance LLC to provide her clients with the tools not only to historically contextualize art, but also to shed light on attribution and legal title within the international art market. Aubrey has researched artworks including paintings, artifacts, works on paper, prints, and sculptures spanning from the 4th century BCE to the 21st century CE. She has appeared as a guest expert on the History Channel and published her scholarship in a variety of publications, including Rick's Journals and the Journal of Art Crime. Well, welcome back, Aubrey. We're really excited to have you back. So, our topic today is planning for provenance. And to start with, can you talk about what exactly provenance is?
Absolutely. So I think for a lot of people, provenance kind of gets this bad rap as just being a bulleted list of dead people that we kind of wonder why it's attached to an artwork in the first place. So from my perspective, and for most collectors, provenance is going to be the history of ownership of an art object from point of creation through to present day. And I think the important distinction here is to make sure that in order to verify that provenance, we need to have documentation backing it up. So the main difference I've really been talking about a lot lately is stated versus verified provenance. So a stated provenance will be kind of just that list of owners like we talked about, but kind of how you see it in an auction catalog or on a wall text or something like that. Whereas the verified provenance is going to be the list of owners with a documentation backing it up, like invoices, archival records, historical photographs, things like that.
All the things that actually support those claims.
Yes, absolutely. And it's kind of important to make that distinction when you are acquiring art. And I know that we're going to kind of jump into this a bit more, but that's one of the big things that I've been coming across lately is like going to art fairs and people saying, oh, look, there's the ownership history, and not necessarily asking what's backing it up or what supports that.
So much happens at such a rapid speed that there are many challenges that come with that, like the speed of a transaction.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that a lot of these sorts of questions about the speed of transaction have been coming across my desk lately. So that's a perfect thing for you to touch on. And it's really interesting because I think it takes us more towards this idea of trusting who you're working with and knowing those people that you are working with because there's so many actors in the art market. It can be difficult to get in and ask those important questions about provenance. And I think sometimes with the speed of a transaction, provenance sometimes tends to fall by the wayside because we're thinking about like, how do I acquire this work? How do I make sure I don't miss out on it and make sure that I'm maintaining the relationships needed to push this transaction through?
Yeah. And on the flip side, the dealers or the artists wanting to make the sale,
Mhm.
it's not the top priority, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how can collectors implement a proactive approach and integrate planning for provenance into their collecting activities?
So I think the first thing that I always say is make sure that when you're looking to acquire works, you ask for the documentation. I usually suggest that people try to ask for it before making an acquisition so that we can do a bit of a risk assessment because provenance in and of itself is can be a very difficult thing to track. So in an ideal world, we have every owner from point of creation through to present day, but that's not, of course, always the case because history is not always kind to specific artworks and to documentation itself. So what we want to do is make sure that we ask for that documentation at the beginning and then do a risk assessment of if there are any gaps that could be problematic in the future, if there are any names listed in that provenance that could be problematic to your ownership in the future, and making sure that clients understand that reviewing a provenance, yes, it's supported by documentation. We want to see that. We want to know how they're coming up with that provenance. But at the same time, it's also about probable movements. So, an example I like to use to kind of illustrate that is going to be Monet and his dealer, Duran Ruel. And I may have talked about this with you guys in the past, but the idea is basically that we might not know how a Monet painting got to Duran Ruel, but we know that Duran Ruel sold it, let's say in the early 1900s. And while we might not have documentation to back up that initial transfer, we know that there's a history of transfers between the two artists. So it's probable and makes sense that Monet would have given that work to his dealer, right? Whereas if we're thinking about things that may have come out of the Second World War, we want to understand the movements of each individual in that provenance to understand if it's probable for those transactions to have taken place. Because you might sometimes come across something where you're seeing someone from Germany giving something to someone in France during the Second World War. And the question is, how is that possible? How would that have been possible? So those are the types of questions that we want to think about. And these also relate us to authenticity, things like clean title that can always disrupt ownership. So that's the first thing, that risk assessment. And then the second thing that I like to suggest is really making sure that you are digitizing all of your documentation, because you want to make sure that you have it easily accessible and able to share it. And it really makes for getting things like appraisals and estate planning and all of those sorts of next steps after acquisition much easier.
That's a great point and something that we've talked about on previous episodes of the podcast. And speaking of technology, do you have any thoughts about some of the new technologies that are emerging that are being linked specifically with claims to guarantee provenance?
Yes, I absolutely do. So I think that tools like blockchain are going to be really helpful for primary market works, especially when they're being entered into the blockchain by, let's say, artists or primary market dealers, because that makes it a lot easier for us to understand, this artist is claiming that this is their work and it's authentic. As works move through owners and as we get more into secondary market works, I think things like blockchain become a bit more difficult to navigate because the blockchain becomes only as good as the people inputting the data. So if you are claiming an artwork on blockchain, we want to ask ourselves questions like who input this data, who did the research, how reliable are they, and when was the last time that research was updated? And that's especially important for secondary market works because provenance is not static. So there's new information constantly coming to light. So just because somebody may have put a provenance in the blockchain 20 years ago doesn't mean that our understanding of that provenance is the same today. And then we also are seeing some companies who are trying to guarantee provenance and clean title. And again, really helpful with contemporary market works, more problematic for secondary market works, especially things like clean title, because there's no universal law on title. So that falls under jurisdictional issues. So for example, in New York, where I live, no stolen property ever gains clean title. So you may have title under good faith laws or something like that in another country, but once it comes here, you might not be considered the rightful owner. So those are things to stay abreast of and make sure that you're, again, trusting the sources that you're getting your information from. And then on the other side of this, I would say AI is going to be a really helpful tool in potentially maybe starting off the research process. But right now, I don't think this tool is in a place to replace human research. And that kind of falls under several different brackets of how AI is currently being set up. So, for example, AI hallucinates, right? So that means it can make stuff up. And I have had already instances where someone is putting in a research question into AI and the AI has generated an entire art historical narrative, primary source documents, legal cases, names of artworks, things like that, that are not real. And then we have to go back and disprove something that's starting to become a catch-all. And then the other kind of two aspects of AI that could be problematic from a provenance perspective in researching your collection, the AI black box. So once an AI is trained and put out there, we have no way of knowing what it's looking at. So what is it scraping? How can we determine if it's actually a comprehensive review of everything available? And then also thinking about how it is it scraping that information, because not all provenance related data is digitized in the first place, and not all digitized material is searchable right now. So there's that question of the catch-all and the reliability of the data. And then the last thing that I'll say on it is really just that there is a time restraint on how up to date the AI that you're using is. So, for example, when I went on to ChatGPT a couple weeks ago, it told me that it couldn't give me any information. I think it was past 2022 or something like that. So we have 2 whole years of potential sales, articles, references to an artwork that it can't even scrape. So I think there are a lot of things for us to think about as we are looking at provenance and these new digital tools.
Yeah. And then AI used without verification plus blockchain seems like that could be an especially terrifying combination.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's room for it to be really helpful. I think it's just making sure that you still have an expert to guide you and are not necessarily just trusting everything that's popping up on screen.
Yeah, because a lot of the information out there that it is scraping is incorrect in the first place. And so that's just replicating that false data and
Mhm.
it's like fake news almost.
Yeah,
Plus the
definitely.
hallucination. One thing just to take a step to the side, maybe for our listeners, because provenance isn't something that everybody comes across day to day, maybe talk about just quickly provenance and authenticity and how they play together, but they're actually separate because I can see people thinking maybe that they're one and the same.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tend to talk to my clients about authenticity being a three-pronged process, right? So that falls under having scientific testing, meaning that the materials and all of the stylistic details that one can test are compliant with the artist that made the work or that supposedly made the work. The second part is going to be the provenance, the ownership history, because the closer we can connect the paperwork and the documentation to the artist, the more reliable that scientific testing becomes. And then the third part is going to be connoisseurship, where we have that expert in a particular artist who can issue their opinion on whether or not they believe the artwork is by that artist. And so these three factors come together to make a little bit of a trifecta that speaks to authenticity. And from a provenance perspective, the more information, the further back we can go, the more credible the other two prongs become, right? And it kind of works as a triangle. The more credible one prong is, the more credible the other two become.
That's a really clear explanation. Thank you.
That's wonderful. I think that the real world part of this where people are it doesn't hit them how important provenance is until they've been burned by a bad provenance is that it's actually critical for the whatever artwork they're purchasing to continue to be considered valid in the future. And so sometimes when it's fast and they're pressured and they want to maintain all their relationships and not lose out, it's very tempting to just snap it up and ask questions later, but that can really bite people. So other than reach out to you in proper provenance, what should people do who are active collectors and up to now they haven't been planning for provenance? Like what are some of the best practices that they should start implementing so that they can really make sure they're collecting in a wise way?
Absolutely. I think that's a really great point and a really great question. I always go back to this and I'll go back to this like a broken record a million times. Start by asking for the documentation. If you haven't been collecting by asking for the documentation previously, that's totally fine because we also know that provenance standards have been changing a lot over the last few years. So things that previously were deemed to be okay to sell without paperwork or anything like that may now not be okay to sell. So what I would say is that for your existing collection, I would suggest going back and reviewing what documentation you do have and tying that in a file to the artwork that it belongs to. I always suggest that you catalog your work as well, whether it's just like a basic spreadsheet or you're going to use a different type of database or a website, perhaps. There are all kinds of different tools that you can use to catalog that and making sure that you have the documentation saved appropriately. Keeping original invoices is always really helpful as your main point of contact. But going back and reviewing that now is always a great step because it's also going to be helpful for things like estate planning. And you don't necessarily want to pass on any unknown problems to your heirs that they may have to take care of. Because as appraisers, we all know that there is the risk if you're doing estate tax or something like that, but you're going to have to put a black market value on something if you can't take away a provenance problem or something like a Holocaust era question that can completely deflate the value of an artwork. And then I'd say that as you're collecting new, again, you want to, again, you want to ask for the documentation. You want to review that documentation and you want to see how reliable is it, right? And you can do that by saying, okay, well, private collection just on its own is not a provenance that can be verified, right? That's just a placeholder. So it would be great. Not always will you be able to get that information, but you want to be able to see, does the seller have the right to sell you the artwork in the first place? I've seen cases where a group of people own an artwork together and one person is trying to sell it without the knowledge of the others, right? Many of us have seen that. So does the seller have the right to sell it? And then how is that stated provenance being backed up? Do they have any previous invoices? Do they have any archival records? What are they using to justify it? And I'm hoping that we should be hoping that it's beyond just like the replication of info in a catalog raisinite, even though that's really great and supporting information. We want to try to have primary source documentation as well.
Yes. And you raised a great point there that if the collector ever wants to sell that artwork in the future, by doing their homework now and getting their provenance in order, that is going to make it a much better process and with better
Absolutely.
results.
Yeah. And it also can, it can also speak to appraisals, opinions of value. The more provenance you have, oftentimes the more valuable your piece can become because you are reducing risk for any future owners. And then if we have things like celebrity provenance that you discover, of course, that can raise the value if the work has been owned by someone famous. And then other ways that it can be raised, again, I go back to this misnomer. A lot of people think that provenance is always only around Holocaust era assets, but they do serve as really sensational examples of how provenance can be helpful. So it's not only that you need to, make sure that something wasn't looted, but if you find out that something was looted and has already been returned to its rightful owner, that story and that provenance can also increase the value of your artwork because you have the story attached to it and you also are mitigating the risk at the same time.
That's a really good point. And one thing that strikes me is if I was a collector and I'm a busy person, this can sound a little bit overwhelming. And it makes me think, oh, maybe people could approach this with a sense of fun, like being a detective and being curious and asking questions, which I think in our notoriously opaque art world is always a good thing. And so to know what types of questions to ask and which things to ask for, which things to believe, and which things not to believe,
Mhm.
like certificates of authenticity could go either way, right?
Yes.
And so I think maybe like encouraging this is like a be a detective, get curious, think of it as a fun process because then people are going to be more likely maybe to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think doing your research, I'm really big into thinking about provenance as biographies of artworks. And I don't know if you guys ever saw that really cheesy movie, The Red Violin, from like ages ago, but that movie was kind of my inspiration for getting into provenance in the first place. And so, just a little mini plot for people who haven't seen it. It basically traces the ownership history of a violin from its point of creation in Italy in like the 1600s. And then we get little vignettes of each person who owned it and how they lived with it and how they used that violin up until it's being auctioned off in the present day. And so I think that as we think about our art objects, they have lived lives that we may never be a part of. There are all these stories. And I think that the stories themselves speak to how we understand the work today. Because let's say Impressionist art, which is one of my areas of specialization, those pieces were not initially well received when they first came out. And they are now considered, in some instances, like they've been the height of beauty and color palettes and style that people are really interested in. And all of that is built on the history of how these artists were able to combat the original perception of their work and introduce new styles into what was largely based in realism before they started to explore with color and the limits of human vision and things like that. And each point of that ownership speaks to the type of collector you have. So if you have somebody who's buying an impressionist work when they're first created, they're really an avant-garde collector that speaks to maybe an early vision. And as they move around, how does that influence our understanding? Maybe the frame is from someone in particular who had a particular vision for that artwork at a point in time. And works really become a part of our life. We live with them. They're intimate to us. And so asking those questions, like you said, Larissa, can really endear you to a work, but also help you be able to share its story.
I love that you brought that up, Aubrey, because I watched that movie too when I was growing up. And that was exactly what I connected with about it. And it really describes why I was first drawn to the field too. It's that these beautiful objects have lived so many lives before us. And that ability to kind of be a channel for their stories. And in knowing their stories, particularly for collectors, it contextualizes that work for, on a deeper level emotionally for them. And then they get to be part of that story. I feel like it's not just a thing anymore. It's like they are living in this of its narrative, which they are now a player in. And so it can be a really powerful form of connecting in a deeper way with your collection to do
Mhm.
your homework with the provenance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can also think of it kind of as a passport. We love collecting stamps and looking at where we've been, and paintings in particular often collect stamps and labels on the back, and they are the passport. And the provenance oftentimes is really just the written, transcribed passport information to show us in a bulleted way where they've been, but building out that context really does speak to the trip.
Yes. Beautiful.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Art Elevator podcast. It was such a pleasure to have you back for a second interview. And I learned so much as I do every time I speak with you.
Thank you, Aubrey.
Thank you both so much for having me. I'm so excited to be back and get to chat with you both.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Art Elevator podcast today. We hope you'll join us for our very next episode.